Hi, I'm Otto Penzler at the Mysterious Bookshop, and I'm here with our weekly show about collecting mysteries. Uh, Last week we did Ellery Queen, and there was so much that I said that we would do a second show, which is what we're going to do today. I covered the first 9 books last week, and today I'm going to cover miscellaneous things, which is an all-encompassing term to use for the many, many things that Ellery Queen did. I have a bunch of books here. I'm probably not going to have time to do them all, but I want to give you a good example, a good start. Um, the two cousins who were Ellery Queen started a second series under a pseudonym. The pseudonym was Barnaby Ross. The Tragedy of X, The Tragedy of Y, The Tragedy of Z, and Drury Lane's Last Case. They're masterful, masterful books. Tragedy of X and Tragedy of Y are Haycraft Queen cornerstones, listed among the greatest books in the history of the genre. They're all about one character, named Drury Lane. Pardon me. Drury Lane is a retired actor, Shakespearean actor, who retires. He's gotten old and he's very wealthy, and he builds Hamlet, which is a castle overlooking the Hudson River, and he kind of makes it into a semi-Elizabethan village, bringing to his estate former friends and colleagues from the stage, including his hunchback wig maker and makeup man, who is his closest ally. And in his very first case, he never even leaves the house, but he solves the crime deductively. Tragedy of X is extremely scarce in Dust Jacket. This book is sold, but I just wanted to show it to you. I do have another copy, and this is a first edition, and it's autographed. But it has a, what is it? Why is it only, oh, I have the wrong book. That's the one that sold, sorry. I put them in the wrong order. This one is a first edition. I'll show you. He moved, the early books were with Frederick Stokes, but he moved to Viking with these books. But this is a vintage copy from Grosset and Dunlap, which is a reprint house. And so it looks the same. The front page, the front cover, everything looks the same, except it's Grosset and Dunlap. And this copy was $6,500, and it's sold. And there's Viking. That's their copyright page. They would show second printing. It doesn't indicate first printing or state first edition in any way. It has no secret codes. It just shows the copyright page, and then would show second printing if there was a second printing. So this is very similar in every way, except it's $125, which is a lot more affordable.
Did you say that one was signed too?
No, the first one was signed. I'm sorry, that one's sold. I got them out of order here a little bit. Here's Tragedy of Y, which is the second book. It's also Viking. And like Tragedy of X, the copyright page will show you no information about it being a first printing, but it also doesn't indicate second printing, which it would if it were a second printing. And this is very common for Viking books in that era. Here's the third book, The Tragedy of Z. They're all four of these early books by Barnaby Ross are quite scarce, and this one's signed as both Barnaby Ross and Ellery Queen. Again, it's a Viking book. I'll show you the same thing redundantly. There's the title page and then the copyright page. Again, no indication of second printing, so we know it's a first. And finally, the book titled Drury Lane's Last Case. And even though Tragedy of X and Y and Z have more familiar names, and they're all scarce in Dust Jacket. Every single one is scarce. I found Barnaby Ross, the last book, to be unusually scarce in Dust Jacket. And here's the first edition, and it's signed. And that is not Frederick Dannay's signature. Frederick Dannay signed most of the Ellery Queen books, whether it was as Barnaby Ross or as Ellery Queen. That's almost certainly Manfred B. Lee. And one more time, the last time, I'll show you the copyright page, identical to the other books, no indication of reprinting. And it's a beautiful copy, and this is $3,500. It's a little less expensive because X and Y are Haycraft Queen cornerstones, and it's unusual for an author to have two books on the Haycraft Queen list at all. And this is not on the list, so it's a little less collected than X and Y. And here's the first British edition, published by Gollancz. Very, very rare. When, during the war, the Second World War, the Brits had paper drives, and so many of the books, one of the first things that would go into these paper drives were mysteries. People had read them. They weren't saving them the way they did poetry, for example. So to find these books in Dust Jacket is extremely, extremely rare. And this is, who's the publisher of this? Castle. Gollancz published almost all of the Ellery Queen books, but they changed publisher for the Barnaby Ross series. And Castle is also easy to tell. They would definitely show second or third printing. So those are the four pseudonymous books, although for Ellery Queen is a pseudonym also. Here's another book by a different author's name, and it's not a pseudonym. Daniel Nathan was Frederick Dannay's birth name. He was born Daniel Nathan, then officially, legally changed his name to Frederick Dannay at a later time. It's a very uncommon book. It's essentially a memoir, and not a mystery. I think the publisher didn't have great expectations for it because it was not known that the author, Daniel Nathan, was half of Ellery Queen, and he wanted to keep it a separate entity altogether, and refused to let the publisher publicize it as Ellery, as being of Ellery Queen. Little Brown in Boston had a very good system, which was really, and they used this for many, many years. The copyright page shows first edition, and underneath that, if it were reprinted, it would show second printing, third printing, etc. This is a very scarce book, especially in this kind of beautiful condition. And this is $500. What else can I show you here? Sometimes, I showed you, I'll get to that later. Here's a book that was published in the United States as a paperback original. Very late in the Ellery Queen series, they began publishing paperback originals, generally, but not always, generally not featuring Ellery Queen. They had other characters. And this, and many of those, almost all of them in fact, were ghosted by other writers. So even though the books from the 60s and 70s that were paperback originals have an Ellery Queen byline, they weren't written by Manfred B. Lee and Frederick Dannay. This is a hybrid. It's an Ellery Queen opening, and then it's about a manuscript that's discovered about Sherlock Holmes taking on Jack the Ripper, written by somebody else that was ghosted, and then it ends with Ellery Queen summing up what was in that manuscript. It's a very, very interesting book. It was published as a paperback original in America, but published as a hardcover in the UK. So this Gollancz edition, and as you see, it's in immaculate condition, which is very uncommon. These yellow jackets that Gollancz used for their books attracted dust from miles around, but this is absolutely clean. Also, Gollancz, it's easy to tell first editions because they would show the date on the title page, but more significantly, they would show on the copyright page no reprint editions. If it was reprint, what they say, they don't use, Gollancz doesn't use the word second printing or third printing, they just say reprint and provides the date on which it was reprinted. But this is a first, and this is 175. The first hardcover edition. What else have I got? Oh, I showed you the first 9 books. Actually, I showed you the first 9 novels last time. Among those early books, mixed in before they finished this first 9 novels, there was a short story collection called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And this is a copy which is inscribed very nicely. And as I've shown you before, Stokes was the publisher of all those early books, and they would show reprints or second printings on the copyright page, and this doesn't have it. This copy does not have a jacket, and it's got a little stain up there. As a result, it's a fairly inexpensive copy, even though it's inscribed, even though it's a first. It's $450 because it's not as perfect as some of the other books I've been showing you. This is a Queen's Quorum title. Now, I've used the word Queen's Quorum on some other books. It's the 106 greatest short story collections ever written, as selected by Ellery Queen, Frederick Dannay, who did great work as a researcher, as a bibliography, as a scholar in the mystery field, in addition to having one of the great collections. So that's a Queen's Quorum title, and here is Queen's Quorum. This is a book that he, as I said, compiled, where it first appeared, the first mention of Queen's Quorum was in his magazine, Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, which he then started running Queen's Quorum in that. Then it appeared in a book called 20th Century Detective Stories, but then it was expanded and published as a book. Again, this is Little Brown, and Little Brown always will say, as I showed you before, first edition on the title page. And this was a beautiful copy, and it was limited to 1,060 copies, which is a very small number for what is a very important reference book. And 60 of those copies were not for sale, but the other 1,000 were, and there it is, a beautiful copy. And it's $125. He also wrote the detective short story, which is the first bibliography ever devoted entirely to the short stories. And this was a catalog or bibliography of all of the short stories that Frederick Dannay was able to discover up to 1951, is it? My memory is so awful. 1942, my mistake. And I made a mistake, another mistake, there are so many. Queen's Quorum did not show a limitation, but the detective short story does show a limitation of 1,060 copies, of which 1,000 were for sale. And this is one of that 1,000 copies. And also immaculate condition, $125. Very hard to find these in great condition because people use them. It's a working tool. My copy, when I first got a copy of this, I annotated it in pencil every time I bought a book because I was trying to collect all of them. I did the same thing with my Queen's Quorum. I would say, oh, fine copy in dust jacket or inscribed or poor copy, look for another, things like that. In addition to writing all of these things and being a scholar, he was also an anthologist. And as I have said many times, I've written it, I've said it, the greatest anthologist who ever lived. And I think this is the greatest anthology that was ever produced. It was 1941, and in this book, he brings all of the major figures in crime fiction who wrote short stories and resurrected some people who had fallen into just being forgotten. And he championed some of these great stories from from an earlier era. Again, this is an Ellery Queen book, and as noted, there's the first edition. It's so helpful when a publisher does that without having some arcane thing like an A on the title, on the copyright page for Scribner, or a numeral sequence, which starts with 2 for Random House, but 1 for everybody else. They just say first edition, and there it is. So that's nice. That is a great copy. It also came out in a Modern Library Giant. This is when I read it for the first time. I had a copy of this edition. Before I collected first editions, I was reading, and I bought this book, and I thought it was the greatest book ever, and it still is. It's a Modern Library, and there it is signed on the title page. Modern Library is a little tricky. I'm not sure you know how to tell a first edition. I'm not sure that I can tell. Maybe you can. There's nothing on the copyright page to indicate a reprint, but I don't know what their system was. So I just have to let it go. And because it's a reprint, even though it has that nice signature on the title page, Ellery Queen and Frederick Dannay identifying it as his, it's only $50 because it's a reprint. And it's got a book plate, so it's not perfect, although this big fat books to show up in nice condition is very, very scarce. His first anthology was a book called Challenge to the Reader. And this is a perfect copy, except it doesn't have a dust jacket. It's not a common book. And what he did, this was an unusual idea and very well made. So many copies of this book, Challenge to the Reader, show up in pretty nice condition. And this was still early, so it was published by Stokes. And as we've talked about before, the Stokes don't show, it would show second printing on the page if it were. So this is an immaculate copy of a book published in 1938, his first anthology, at $75. But he also did something else. Here's the same book, but look at the binding. It's a half leather binding, and they made 50 copies of this book, none of which were for sale, but they were all provided to the contributors to the book and other people involved. This is Stokes, this is published by Stokes, so a member of the Stokes family got this book, and every copy was signed. And these are very rare, total of 50 copies of this, and quite rare, and this is in great condition at $750. Just quickly, I'll show you another book. This is The Murderers of Fox. By this time, he had left Stokes and gone to Little Brown. And there it is. And again, Little Brown always shows first edition on the copyright page. A lovely copy, little chipping, but fairly uncommon, and I'm not sure why it's so uncommon. Scarlet Letter. This is one of the early books that moves away, where the Ellery Queen character changes and he becomes a more realistic figure, not quite so much like Philo Vance. And again, it's Little Brown. I won't show you but it's the same thing. I don't want to run out of time. published in the UK by Gollancz. Gollancz published all of the Ellery Queen books, all of them. And I just want to show this one because it has a wraparound band, if you can tell that, which is very rare. I've never seen another copy where it's got that original wraparound band. Everybody threw those away because they served no purpose. I'll show you one more book from this era, and this is interesting. This is an unusually good book, but largely ghosted. Fred Dannay came up with the plot, but it was written by Theodore Sturgeon. And this copy is autographed by Theodore Sturgeon with his little mark, a Q with an arrow going through it. This is pretty rare. I've not seen one before. There may be others that probably are, but I think this is pretty remarkable. And it's 300. Later books, again, there's Little Brown showing first printing on the copyright page. Later books we started to get in larger quantities, so they're not quite as rare. He also wrote, the Queens also wrote, or had their name on at least, Juveniles. And here's Ellery Queen Jr. I think that these were ghosted. I should have asked Richard Dannay, Frederick Dannay's son, was here last night when we had a little talk about American Mystery Classics. I should have asked him if he knew if these were all being ghosted by somebody else. I don't think the Queens were actually writing this series. This is Stokes, again, the early books, and again, the copyright page shows no reprint, so you know it's a reprint. Speaking of children's books, he did a couple in this series of Better Little books. And these were definitely for children. They were kind of like comic books because there was an illustration on every page with the text facing it. And look at the condition of this for a children's book that is very fragile and rarely shows up in nice shape. So that's that's The Adventure of the Murdered Millionaire, and that was $75. And here's something that's really rare, I think. The Last Man Club in the same series. Again, this has got a little more beat up, but very unusual to have it signed. Fred Dannay, and certainly Manny, but the Ellery Queen authors rarely had these books in front of them to sign. So, and that is 150. So that's Ellery Queen. Thank you for